Three's the Charm by MissCHSparkles, Chapter 25. Ah! Harry exclaimed, his heart beating furiously against his chest as he came awake. With his bed curtains drawn, he was bathed in darkness, but his eyes could dimly make out the bed before him with a couple of sweet wrappers at the end of it. They glinted slightly from the very small crack of light in the curtains gave, and Harry watched them as he tried to bring his breathing under control. He had just experienced his first nightmare in several months, and his heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. Harry rubbed his tired eyes. He had been up late celebrating Gryffindor's win over Slytherin. It had been a very exciting game, and although Harry hadn't swallowed any snitches this time, he still managed a vertical dive for the snitch from 50 feet, where the Slytherin seeker had been forced to pull out. Harry had been pulled out of his dive just at the right moment, lunging forward and snatching the snitch while successfully flying forward off his broom and hitting the ground. Thanks to his training, he had managed to roll and finish only slightly winded on his back, clutching the little golden ball in one hand. It was the team pounding on his back that probably had given him the large bruises on his back, rather than his tumble off his nimbus. Oliver had been beside himself with glee, utterly convinced that this year they were going to win this year, and Harry was allowing himself to be cautiously optimistic that they would. But he had a lot more on his mind than Quidditch right now. "Bugger!" he muttered to himself, flinging his covers off and opening the curtains of his four-poster, snatching up his glasses from the bedside table. Ignoring the snores of the other boys, he trudged over to the window, only wincing at the cold floor. With a sigh, he sat on the wide windowsill and stared out into the grounds, which were only just illuminated by the dawn's first light. There were still some sweets scattered about, so he grabbed a chocolate frog and started to eat it. It was hard to forget the distorted dream he had had, and the feelings he had experienced. Unlike his visions, which tended to play almost like films, this had been a series of jumbled images that had no real order to them, and he was already forgetting some of them. But others were perfectly clear, and he felt a little ill at the thought of them. If you hear noises in the background, I have very noisy jackdaws living just outside my window, which I absolutely hate. Wake me up at like 4 in the morning almost every day. But others were perfectly clear, and he felt a little ill at the thought of them. They had all had a main theme. What if he couldn't handle seeing Sirius? And even worse, what if Sirius somehow found out what he was? Sirius had always been there for him, but he was expecting a very different Harry Potter to the one he was going to get. How could he pretend to be an innocently 11-year-old when he was desperately just wanting to confess everything to his godfather? But what if Sirius took it really badly? He already felt guilt over Harry's parents. Imagine how he'd feel if he heard all that had happened to Harry. Or perhaps he wouldn't believe him and think he needed serious time in St. Mungo's to secure his ward. He really didn't want that. He wondered how Sirius was doing. This time they hadn't officially met. He hadn't sent any letters, as he wanted their first interaction to be a face-to-face one. Each day that passed, his excitement at finally seeing his godfather alive and well had been building, but now he couldn't help but feel a little scared. He just hoped that nothing went wrong. Much later that day, with the sun already setting, a thin man, slightly haunted-looking man, entered the sitting room at the Burrow. "Arthur?" The bespectacled man mumbled, lifting his head up. He had been half dozing in his chair. Sirius smiled and walked over to him. "Here, Molly instructed me to give you this." He offered it to the older man, who took it. "You're going to work after dinner, aren't you?" "Sadly, yes," Arthur agreed, placing the cup on the table beside him so he could push his glasses up and rub his eyes. "They overwork you, Arthur," Sirius stated with concern, settling himself in another chair. His physical progress had been amazing, even though he was still much too thin. He was looking less like a skeleton now. Of course, simply being clean with cut hair was a difference. Of course, being clean simply with cut hair that was no longer matted did make a big difference, as well as decent robes. Molly kept giving him extra helpings, and day by day he was eating more. "That's what Molly says," Arthur said with a small smile, now swallowing a mouthful of tea. "She'd like me to apply for another department." But you like where you are now? Sirius questioned, and Arthur nodded. I do. Muggle objects are so fascinating, he said enthusiastically, and it's a vital job. So many Muggle objects get enchanted, and deliberately or accidentally, they can end up in Muggle hands. The results can be utterly disastrous, and you need someone like me to go and fix it. Sirius nodded. He could imagine how easy it would be to bewitch innocent-looking objects and slip them amongst an unsuspecting Muggle crowd. It was a safer way to Muggle Bay with the decreased risk of getting caught. All they had to do was observe at a distance and feel smug and superior. How many people are in your department? Sirius asked now. Including me, Arthur asked sardonically. 2. The second is Perkins. 2? Sirius said in disbelief. You mean there's just 2 of you to deal with all those Muggle objects that get bewitched? That's about it, Arthur said, and sometimes I am requested to help magical law enforcement cover raids, in case they run into anything that might fall under my jurisdiction. Do they pay you extra for that? Sirius asked, already suspecting the answer. Not much, Arthur shrugged. The present government doesn't see much importance in the department. It only exists because no one else wants to bother with Muggle enchantments. This made Sirius scowl. No doubt his family loved this position. Those of his family tree not dead or in prison probably encouraged this view for all they were worth. That's not right, he declared, and Arthur shrugged. I'm just lucky I can do a job I love, he said, smiling slightly. Sirius glanced at a piece of parchment in his hand. It was a list of things Molly had gotten for him using his money. Robes, food, etc. She was not going to allow anyone to say her family was taking advantage of the fact that Sirius had authorized them to withdraw gold from his vaults. Sirius didn't believe for a moment they'd take advantage of him. We only had to spend a little time with them to know how honest they were. Frankly, he wouldn't mind if they spent a bit on themselves. Not only were they looking after him, but it would feel so good to think about what his mother would say if she knew. As the Black family heir, he now had control of the family fortune and its assets, meaning he could spend it on whatever he wanted, including helping so-called blood traitors. I guess at some point I'll have to think about getting a job, Sirius mused. I don't fancy sitting around doing nothing, especially as Harry's in school most of the year. I'm sure you'll find something, Arthur said with a smile. I believe we should have a few leaflets lying around, of jobs available out there. Bill and Charlie left some, and Percy brought some home when school broke up for the summer. Sirius let out a bark of laughter. I remember those leaflets, he chuckled. McGonagall handed them out to everyone in 5th year. He sighed reminiscently. I think I'll need a few remedial lessons before I start applying for anything. If anyone will have me. He mused to himself. Right now he wasn't overly worried. He had a lot to sort out before starting to look for a job, and he hadn't enough money to live on. It was more the social aspect of the job that he craved, being able to talk to others, joke and laugh. Then he remembered he still didn't know if he'd need to go back to the ministry for a hearing because of a certain potions master hadn't made up his mind yet. Snape's taken his sweet time, Sirius now grumbled as Arthur gave him a knowing look. You didn't get on with him in school, did you? That's putting it lightly, he snorted. Do any of your boys? Bill achieved a NEWT in potions, was the reply as Arthur smoothed the cover of his old book, and Percy fully intends to do the same as Bill. Charlie wasn't interested in pursuing an NEWT grade. And it's a little early to say if the twins or Ron will take the class in their 6th year. Professor Snape only accepts an O in OWLs. An O! Sirius exclaimed in disbelief. Bill says he only wishes to teach the very best, Arthur said lightly, and in a way I can see the argument. If you can come out of his class with an NEWT grade, then you clearly have talent for the subject. I've heard he is credited with producing the very best potioneers in the whole of Europe, and quite possibly beyond. Oh, he was always good at potions, Sirius stated rather dismissively. But only taking O students is ridiculous. Slughorn at least took E's. It's his choice, Arthur stated simply. I believe his standards are a little higher than Slughorn's. Not that he wasn't a good teacher, but... but at times he was more concerned with his students' prospects and connections. A voice declared, and they turned to see Molly standing there with a flour-dusted apron, a batter-covered wooden spoon in one hand. Sirius had a feeling the way Slughorn had operated was something of a sore spot for Molly, and it probably involved her husband. "At least Professor Snape has no time for that nonsense," she continued briskly. "He might be a little strict, but no one can argue that some of our boys don't deliberately cause trouble sometimes." "They're twins," Arthur said simply to Sirius, hiding a smile. Sirius hadn't met the infamous Fred and George, but he was getting reasonably certain he was going to get on with them. "Besides," she said, swooping in to take Arthur's empty cup of tea, sprinkling a little flour onto his book, "from what Ron said in his letters, Harry seems to get on quite well with him." Sirius twitched at that. Ever since Dumbledore had told him that Harry actually got along with the greasy git, he had been worried about what that could mean for their relationship. Until Lily dumped the bastard, she had never wanted the Marauders' time of day. Except for Remus. What if Snape so subtly started to plant things into Harry's mind, turning him against his godfather? "Dinner will be ready in half an hour," Molly said briskly, bustling back to the kitchen. "What's that?" Sirius questioned as Arthur lifted his book up to brush the flour off it. "Oh, just a Muggle book I once picked up, on dreams and such," he said, gazing at the volume. Recently, he'd been consulting it a lot more often, and it was all due to an incident over the summer. Flashback. Molly had slipped a little dreamless sleep into Ron's hot cocoa. After he fell asleep, she put him to bed. She was worried. "Oh, Arthur! For him to have such a vivid dream!" Molly said. She didn't know why it worried her, but it did. Something wasn't right. Her mother's instinct was telling her that her baby needed to be protected, but she simply didn't know what from, and it was frustrating. "Molly, well, it might not have been a dream." "Not exactly," said Arthur. He had been thinking. Ron's dream was too vivid, too specific. Dreams weren't like that. They were random and didn't make a whole lot of sense. They were the brain's way of dealing with stuff. He knew that much. A few years previously, he had been sent to a Muggle charity shop due to reports of wizarding possessions accidentally being donated there. Apparently the deceased wizard had been a Muggle-born, and thus certain relatives hadn't known what they were giving away. After being given a budget of galleons to convert to Muggle pounds, Arthur had gone to said charity shop to recover the enchanted items. While he was there, he saw a couple of books on dream interpretation, astrology and divination, and bought them. He had believed they were wizard books because one had a crystal ball in the front. It turns out Muggles had something similar to divination. He showed the covers to his boss, who had thought that they looked like wizard books too, so he didn't have to pay the ministry back for the books. That was a lucky break he still remembered fondly. If he could have, he would have taken a Muggle course on psychology when he first graduated from Hogwarts. It was fascinating. He read about dreams and what they meant, and the theories behind them, including the one that stated a dream was simply the brain's way of processing daily events, and rarely meant anything. This was too vivid to be a simple dream. Then Arthur remembered. His great-uncle Percival was a seer. He had kept a dream journal, and almost every single dream came true, even to the rise and fall of Grindelwald. If his great-uncle Percy was still alive, then he'd contact him. But Percy had died a few years before Voldemort's rise. "What do you mean, Arthur?" asked Molly. "Well, my great-uncle Percy, the one we named Percy after, he was a seer. He had dreams, vivid dreams like that. And, well, most of the time, his dreams would come true. Ron may have inherited a portion of his seer ability. I know my brothers and I didn't get any. But, well, seer traits are tricky. They can manifest once in a person, and never manifest again. Or, like my uncle, they can be so strong they manifest daily. His dad, my great-great-uncle Bilius, had one vision when he was 10, and never had another vision. So it is entirely possible that Ron may have had a vision instead of a dream," Arthur said. "But Arthur, Ronnie fighting he who must not be named, Fred dying, Percy hexing someone?" Mercy asked. It can't be.
That's the point, though, Molly. His dream was too specific. The joke Percy told, Fred's reaction, the Death Eater thick Ness who killed the previous minister, and all the other details are just too specific. And how could Ronald have said that name without fear? We have never mentioned him by name, only by his titles. Sure, Ronald could have, and even would have, heard it from his brothers, but he also would have learnt to fear the name too, much like we do. His reaction, his ability to say the name without thinking, that cannot come from a simple dream, said Arthur. I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll write to Dumbledore, and tell him the dream, and our suspicions, and then we'll push Dumbledore to do everything in his power to make sure it doesn't happen that way. I'll speak to Amelia, and even Cornelius on Monday, and...
No, you won't speak to Cornelius. He hates you. Speak to Amelia. Speak to Rufus, and make plans. Then we'll contact Dumbledore, so that if Ron dreamed is a vision, we'll be ready, said Molly. She knew that Fudge hated her husband, and if he talked about what Ron saw in his dreams, he'd be fired and Ron might end up being sent to the Unspeakables. Arthur had agreed with his wife. While Fudge seemed harmless, he had a tendency to listen to the likes of Lucius Malfoy a bit too much. It was unlikely he'd take the revelation that a young boy was having visions of you-know-who returning in the near future well.
Looks like divination, Sirius said, making a face. I never understood that subject, and I'm glad I never took it. Too wishy-washy.
Arthur chuckled. He had to admit, when he was in school, he hadn't been interested either. However, as he'd read both wizard and muggle books on the subject, he was being drawn into it. He only hoped he could work out what Ron's dream really meant, before it was too late. Hogwarts. It's a shame Remus Secrets is out, Harry said wistfully as they exited the castle, and walked down the stairs to the grounds. Do you think we'll ever have him as a teacher? Who knows? Ron shrugged. Lucius Malfoy won't be happy about him teaching his precious son. Draco doesn't have to go, Harry muttered. After Sirius's trial, there had been, of course, a lot of news coverage, with reporters splashing as many juicy details across it as they could muster. And one of the details had been the fact that they'd become animagi in order to assist their werewolf friend. The Daily Prophet eagerly explained to its readers that the wolfsbane potion, which allowed werewolves to retain their mind, had not yet been invented, meaning that the werewolf in question had not been safe when he transformed. Harry was very annoyed that Rita Skeeter had jumped upon this like a starving dog upon a bone, and had started enthusiastically declared this clear proof that Dumbledore was senile and should start looking for his replacement. And the media storm was only gathering momentum. Harry suspected even the Quibbler might end up running a piece on it. He had known that at Sirius's trial, it would come out. After all, how could Sirius possibly explain why he and Pettigrew were animagus, without talking about Remus? Barely anyone took the time and effort to become an animagi. And they'd only done it for a very specific reason. Anyway, even if Sirius had tried to keep it quiet, there would have been nothing stopping Pettigrew from blurting it out to the world. It was one of those really unfortunate but unavoidable things. I've been thinking, Hermione said as they walked to Hagrid's hut. It would be a really good idea to have some Polyjuice potion handy, for any missions we might need to take on. Sounds good, Ron agreed. But where would we get the boomslang skin and stuff? Snape's office? Well, Hermione said slowly, I was actually thinking it might be better if we buy it. I have a savings account, but my parents might question if I took a lot out of it. But I was considering trying to get a summer job. A summer job? Harry questioned. Yes, she said with a nod. I've been thinking recently. I want to keep closer ties to the Muggle world. You know I always loved being with you guys, but I don't want to drift away from my parents again. The boys weren't silent. When they had been younger, it hadn't really struck them that Hermione spent less and less time with her parents. Harry knew that was mostly due to him, that she sacrificed her precious family time. Hermione, he began guiltily, but she cut him off. It's all right, she said with a small smile. It's in the past. There's no point dwelling on it. But the best thing we can do is move forward. Besides, I was only planning on finding something part-time. We could still spend time together. You both need to come and stay at mine. We can go to a fun fair, like I said. There's also the cinema, the beach that usually has a water slide, a bowling alley. I have no idea what most of those are, but they sound good, Ron said with a grin. Do you guys have a fireplace? We could flew over. I'm afraid not, Hermione said, as Harry asked, What about side apparition? Maybe Sirius or Ron's parents could take us over to yours. That could work, she said with a slow nod. You could always talk it over at Christmas. We'll be in contact with Hedwig at the very least. Maybe we could meet up with you and your parents, suggested Harry. Let them see a bit more of the Wizarding World. She smiled. She liked that idea. I also thought that a paper would be a good idea. The Wizarding World needs a paper that isn't so controlled by the Ministry of Magic. She continued. We've got the Quibbler, Ron reminded her. Yes, but most people only read it for amusement. Let's face it, the majority of the stories are conspiracy theories or the goblins being cooked in pies. The aura is being controlled by Nargles and other nonsense like that. I know it published Harry's stories and it got a lot better, but it's a one-man operation. It was vulnerable to intimidation. She explained. You got that right, Ron grumbled, a scowl on his face, at the mention of Xenophilius Lovegood. He had not forgiven the man for betraying them to the Death Eaters. Idiot. You're not going to say that to Luna? Hermione asked with concern, knowing from past experience that the young Ravenclaw did not like anyone casting doubt on her eccentric father. No. What? What? No, why would I? He said in complete innocence. But he is. Perhaps, but not to her, she said knowingly, as Hagrid came round his hut and waved at the sight of them. Afternoon tea with Hagrid. What could be better? End of chapter. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed that one. Ugh, I just like this, you know? And that thing about Ron's visions things. I can't remember if that turns into anything, but it might. Anyway, you guys know the drill. Like, comment and subscribe and hit that bell to get notified whenever I upload a new video. Have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you're in. Bye my guys, gals, and albino pals. I'll see you in another video. Take care. Sorry if you heard any jackdaws as well. They're outside my window. Hate those things.